Hello, this Jungian Life listeners. This is Lisa, and I wanted to let you know that there are a couple of spots available for my upcoming women's fairy tale and yoga retreat. We're going to be meeting April 20th through 23rd in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania at a beautiful spot, 150 natural acres. We're going to have yoga 2 times a day, and also we're going to be diving into some fairy tales. I did this in the fall, and it was really, really special. So if you feel moved, you can check out the link at my website, lisamarciano.com, and then click on the Retreats tab. So hopefully see you there. Bye.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today, we're going to talk about panic attacks, panic disorder, that incredible primal feeling that can come over us sometimes when we're thrust into circumstances where it might seem reasonable to panic, but often in circumstances that don't make sense to us and may not objectively seem threatening. As a way to lean into panic from an archetypal level, we have to include the Greek god Pan, who is associated with that particular experience of distress. And Pan, as the god of instincts, perhaps older than the Olympians, puts us into that archaic level of the psyche where the irrational parts of ourselves reside, which can leap forward at moments, overriding our best sense and putting us into that animal state of stampeding or fleeing or not knowing what's going on around us. So, in service to Pan, let's start with an evocation to Pan from the Homeric hymns. And to contextualize it, people were pretty afraid of the ancient gods, and so when they sang their praises, they definitely kept to the lighter side of things. Muse, tell me about Pan, the dear son of Hermes, with his goat's feet and 2 horns, the lover of merry noise. Through wooded glades he wanders with dancing nymphs who foot it on some sheer cliff's edge, calling upon Pan, the shepherd god, long-haired, unkempt. He has every snowy crest and the mountain peaks and rocky crests for his domain. Hither and thither he goes through the close thickets, now lured by soft streams, and now he presses on amongst the towering crags and climbs up to the highest peak that overlooks the flocks. Often he courses through the glistening high mountains, and often on the shouldered hills he speeds along, slaying wild beasts, this keen-eyed god. Only at evening, as he returns from the chase, he sounds his note, playing sweet and low on his pipes of reed. Not even she could excel him in melody, that bird who in flower-laden spring poured forth her lament, utters honey-voiced song amidst the leaves. At that hour, the clear-voiced nymphs are with him and move with nimble feet, singing by some spring of dark water, while echo wails about the mountain top, and the god on his side, or on that of the choirs, or at times sidling into the midst, plies it nimbly with his feet. On his back he wears a spotted lynx pelt, and he delights in high-pitched songs in the soft meadow where crocuses and sweet-smelling hyacinths bloom at random in the grass. They sing of the blessed gods and high Olympus, and choose to tell of such an one as luck-bringing Hermes above the rest, how he is the swift messenger of all the gods, and how he came to Arcadia, the land of many springs, and mother of flocks, there where his sacred place is as a god of Selene. For there, though a god, he used to tend curly-fleeced sheep in the service of a mortal man, because there fell on him and waxed strong melting desire to wed the rich-tressed daughter of Dryops, and there he brought about the merry marriage, and in the house she bare Hermes, a dear son from his birth, was marvelous to look upon, with goat's feet and 2 horns, a noisy, merry, laughing child. But when the nurse saw his uncouth face and full beard, she was afraid, and sprang up and fled and left the child. Then luck-bringing Hermes received him and took him in his arms. Very glad in his heart was the god, and he went quickly to the abodes of the deathless gods, carrying his son wrapped in warm skins of mountain hares, and set him down beside Zeus, and showed him to the rest of the gods. Then all the immortals were glad in heart, and Bacchic Dionysus in especial. And they called the boy Pan, because he delighted all their hearts. And so hail to you, Lord. I seek your favor with a song.
Oh my gosh, that was so beautiful. I don't think I'd ever actually heard that whole thing before, Joseph. Thank you. Before we launch further into our topic, I just want to remind you all about Dream School. Dream School is our 12-month online self-paced course on how to interpret your dreams using a Jungian frame. So the 3 of us walk you through how to use Jung's ideas to learn how to work with your dreams and really harness that wisdom. And we hope that you'll join us. So you can take a look at our website, thisjungianlife.com, and you want to check out Dream School.
So there's one vision of Pan as a bearded, goat-footed, noisy, merry, laughing child who just sprang from the womb of a nymph and a child of Hermes, who is one of the patrons of shepherds as well. And as this primordial image continued to live and express itself in the ancient world, it took on a lot of different valences.
I'm thinking about the stories of Pan, who could frolic and be a spirit of nature, but if he was awakened suddenly from a nap, that he would let out some kind of a really horrific shriek, and that would be the note of panic. People would run. There would be stampedes. And I'm kind of thinking about how he is the etymological root of our word panic, and the significance of that shriek, and how sound can alarm us. And what turns that switch on in us that all of a sudden creates a state of panic?
I think we've probably all at least observed in a moment where there'll be a cry from within a bird flock, and then suddenly hundreds of birds will vault into the sky because some alarm has been given, and the way that the energy of that sweeps through these hundreds, sometimes even thousands of creatures as they try to avoid, I suspect, some kind of danger.
So that image of a flock of birds starting and that something kind of sweeps through the whole population, which of course we can see how adaptive that would be from a survival standpoint, that one bird hears something or receives some input stimulus, that there's something amiss, and everyone just takes that as a communication to flee right away. But we could see how panic is something that can just reverberate through a whole group. And I think that does happen with humans as well. And as we know, if you're a bird watcher, many times what causes the startle is not really a threat.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is the hawk that's just flown over. But sometimes it's just the back door swung closed.
And doesn't that happen in us? I know that when a fire alarm goes off, my heart rate goes up in a nanosecond as the fire alarm is intended to spark that kind of a reaction. We're talking about threat. And whether it's a flock of birds or a fire alarm or Pan's shriek, there is something physiological that happens automatically to a perceived threat. And that's so important to distinguish a perceived threat from an actual saber-toothed tiger strolling through the backyard.
But I think the thing is that we can't always know if it's a real threat or not. And at the level of our body doesn't know. So whether or not there's an actual fire or you're just hearing the fire alarm, your amygdala responds in much the same way.
I think that we rely on the signals from other creatures or other people in our flock to avoid the direct encounter with the danger. That if a bird is being attacked by the cat and it can shriek in the midst of that, the other birds aren't going to run over to evaluate the situation personally. They're going to hear it from 30 feet away and they're going to take to the air, because on that instinctive level, we do trust each other. We assume that if one person or one creature is howling out of some distress, something's wrong and we're all vulnerable. So undoubtedly, human beings have overridden that impulse sometimes. Firemen run into the fire, which is contra naturam. It takes this enormous amount of egoic strength. But of course, the instinctive feeling is to flee the danger and flee it before it gets to us. And so we depend on these signals. And again, as you were saying, the fire alarm is meant to drive us out of the building before we encounter the direct danger. So we're willing to suspend our curiosity and suspend the direct encounter in favor of the primordial alarm.
So this is taking me to wanting to come to a little bit of a physiological understanding of what happens when we have a panic attack. And this is a little above my pay grade, so hopefully some neuroscientists will write into the podcast and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But my understanding is that for whatever reason, there is a release of adrenaline into the bloodstream. And this causes our heart rate to rise, and our breathing becomes shallower and faster. And we're sort of physiologically aware of this feeling of arousal and fear. And it's unsettling, it's frightening. We might think we're having a heart attack. So what often happens at that point is we become even more afraid. So there is a feedback loop that happens. We become more afraid. There's more adrenaline released. We become more aroused, and we really worry. I mean, people can go to the ER afraid that they're having a heart attack. And from what I understand, heart attacks can feel like panic attacks, and panic attacks can feel like heart attacks. So it's if you have a doubt, it's good to get it checked out. But it's also important to realize once you know it's a panic attack, the body will re-regulate. This will stop. It will go away. The body cannot stay in that state of arousal. And that this is just kind of the body doing what the body's going to do, in a sense.
It's also informative to be able to think and to verbalize about what is going on rather than simply reacting. The system was installed in us, so to speak, so that we would react and override reason at first act. But in today's world, it's helpful to say this is what is going on internally. It is called a panic attack. Nothing bad is happening to me. To also have that observing stance of now I know what it is. The first time, yes, go get it checked out. Heaven knows one wouldn't want to ignore what might be a heart attack or some kind of asthmatic attack or something like that. But once you know, you also have the option of being able to label it, think about it, and wait, because the body cannot sustain that level of arousal. And to let the body do what the body does. It's wired to react to an alarm, even a false alarm.
We're in a unique position as human animals, that we have the benefit of the cortex and we have the benefit of the ego. So there is some part of ourselves that can reflect on the instinctive impulses and have a cognitive process about it, just as you were saying, Deb, that we can make a choice to contain these certain energies and to hold until we have a sense of evaluation, which in most modern environments is probably a wiser thing to do. Because as we are saying with our clients and sometimes with ourselves, panic can be triggered by non-threatening environments that don't warrant that intense degree of preparation to fight or flee.
But going back to the importance of physiology here, there is a very strong biological set of determinants that go on here. There's some wonderfully fancy language about the amygdala and the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, et cetera, that brain researchers, neurologists have identified. And it's kind of validating to know that there is a lot of biology going on. And there is about a 40% heritability factor in basically how you or I were wired. And I will put out here, I was wired for it. So this is a topic that is close to my heart and to my brain system and all the rest of my biology. So there's temperament and there are psychodynamics. Early childhood history as ever, parental behavior, separations, other kinds of traumas factor in. And we do have a frontal cortex that can observe, be curious, know what it is, label it, wait it out. That basically it's how do we deal with fear.
There's a book that I really love on neurobiology that talks about the need to get to know your amygdala. And I really like that concept, but it goes to what you're saying, Deb, that we are all born with a certain kind of set point for biology, biological set point for anxiety. And some of us are just more reactive than others. And so there's, and then of course, personal history does play in, does shape that. It's not purely biological, but by the time we come to adulthood, we have a certain way that we're going to respond. And being aware of that, I like that notion of kind of getting to know your amygdala, because it implies what you were referring to, an observing stance where you're going to have this sort of arousal. And then maybe there's a little bit of a dialogue that you can have.
Absolutely.
About, okay, is what's going on here? Now, I just want to underscore that just because you're able to label something as, well, this is a panic attack, or I'm aroused right now physiologically, but there's nothing really to be afraid of, it does not mean that the arousal goes away. That's not how this works. But knowing that may allow you to sit with it and tolerate it until your body re-regulates.
And there is plasticity in the brain. And by practicing an internal dialogue, labeling it, we're really creating much more of a connection between the amygdala, which is our fight or flight center, and the frontal cortex, our thinking function. And it makes a difference. We can grow dendrites in the brain any day, and we do it all the time. We learn things, we go places, we have experiences. So labeling it and that dialogue internally makes a huge difference.
And I think in our own consideration, we might frame anxiety, fear, and panic slightly differently. And even in the ancient world, there were some different gods assigned to these different qualities, and that panic is uniquely assigned to Pan. And what I would submit in some ways pre-existed much of the higher brain functions that we have enjoyed. So panic, I think, comes from the deepest strata inside of ourselves. And when it is linked to legitimate danger, it is in service to surviving. That it is life itself that is providing the energetic resources to run away from the tiger, or to fight the hyena, or to signal to the family to get behind you or flee into the forest while you try to face off with something that is quite legitimately dangerous. So we can't avoid that strata of the archaic psyche. And yet, if we live in a culture that doesn't allow us to conceptualize this archetypally, it can go underground and create problems for us. So in the ancient world, Pan was understood, of course, in that world thought of as a god, but we can think about this as an archetypal reality associated, as with the Homeric hymn, with nature itself, with the music of birdsong, with fertility and reproduction, and particularly with this flocking or herding tendency. He was the patron of shepherds, as was his father, Hermes, but that says something about that ancient impulse that we have as mammals and as humans to want to group together, and the benefits of being in the group, and the need that we have in some ways to be shepherded. There's a reason that we took that little tiny image from pagan archetypal structures and inserted it into Christianity, that Christ is the shepherd and that we are lambs. That idea pre-exists Christianity by a great measure. In the ancient world, Pan was the god that looked out for all creatures and sounded the alarm, had the eye that was higher, wider, had the unimpaired intuition and far-seeing eye, as Homer depicts, in order to signal what's the safe path, where is the danger, how do we get away from dangers that we could not surmount, or how do we take something on if we're backed into a corner. So those qualities show up in the later mythopoetic story of Christ as the shepherd and we as the sheep, that Christ now has the long view, the one who can ascertain danger and keep us all safe. So there's something about that we really still need and need to have some kind of a relationship to.
And there actually is a correlation between a tendency toward panic or panic disorder and a particularly strong need for relationship, for people, for security. That there is something about separation anxiety, and then that can lead to sometimes the fight part of the fight or flight dynamic that everyone is familiar with. So that stuff about herds and flocks and belonging and a shepherd, we are very much social creatures. We very much need contact with one another, and feeling exposed and alone can be very much part of a panic attack.
I want to pick up on the role that fear plays and the sort of fear of fear. Because as I laid out a minute ago, when you first start feeling that physiological arousal, it creates more fear. And then what often happens is when someone has a panic attack, I mean, they're awful. They're truly, truly awful. And if you've had one, you become afraid of having another one, even though you know it's just a panic attack. You start thinking, well, what if this happens when I'm out on a date? What if this happens when I'm driving? What if this happens when I'm at work? What if this happens when I'm having a meeting with my boss? And it can become really disabling. The fear that you're going to have a panic attack can become disabling.
Yeah.
And Deb, I so appreciated what you said a minute ago about the brain's plasticity, that we can either kind of bump up our fear about our fear, and then life becomes smaller and we become perhaps even disabled. That's an extreme thing that happens, but it does happen. Or we can sort of be with ourselves in a way that acknowledges the great wisdom of the body and of Pan, the nature god. We can make space for that while at the same time kind of making friends with this capacity in ourselves, without reacting to it with this kind of level of literalism and seriousness, where it then begins to kind of encapsulate us. And I think one of the ways to do this is to take an archetypal perspective, which means that we can relate to these symptoms symbolically, that we take them seriously, but we don't take them literally, that we see if we can make friends with the great god Pan in our lives. I think that can kind of broaden things out and help us relate to this tendency in ourselves in a more constructive way.
I'm also wanting to pick up on your really good point, Lisa, about how people can literalize things. That, if I went in to take an exam and I had a panic attack, then making that false correlation that because I was nervous about the exam and then I went in and that's where it was, therefore I need to be in an exam-free environment. Or I had a panic attack when I was at a mall, therefore I shouldn't go to malls anymore. What can happen is a kind of agoraphobia can set in. The fear of the marketplace is what it means from the ancient Greek. But that people's worlds get smaller and smaller because the fear of having a panic attack makes us sort of constrict. And that cognitive error really, really needs to be challenged. This is an internal phenomenon, not caused by an external world situation, whether it's a college classroom or a particular store or something else. To not let that fear close us down in a false attempt at safety.
That's beautifully, beautifully said.
And so if we move a little bit into that psychodynamic perspective, that our irrational anxieties, irrational fears, irrational panics are related to the excessive repression of the instinctive life of one kind or another. So, with the rise of Christianity, and even in those first 50 years after what we think of as the birth of Christ, and the beginning of that mythopoetic religious movement, there was an enormous shift in attitude toward the instinctive life, that fantasies of purity, the kind of Manichaean split between earth and spirit, the demonization of sexuality and instinctive impulses, all in favor of a kind of transcendent perfection. And as cultures shift back and forth, actually, between these various cultural ideals, parts of ourselves get massively repressed. Freud was most interested in the repression of sexuality, which is interesting to our conversation because Pan is the most fundamental of the fertility gods, that he is the god of the rut, of the spring rut. He is the god that makes sure that the flocks are fertile and that the deer will breed and the birds will lay eggs, and by extension that a human family will also breed and thrive and fertility will be foremost. So Freud observed that when instinctive satisfaction is totally blocked, there's an enormous buildup of unsatisfied instinct, which takes on a toxic character. And that toxic quality can be vented out to the side, so to speak. If we imagine some of those drawings that we saw in earth science when we were kids, there's a way in which this volcanic material is boiling and pressing and pressing. It doesn't always shoot right out the top. It creates all of these vents off to the side, trying to move some of the heat and pressure out in indirect ways. And the human psyche is not unlike that. If we say no to Pan, and we do that in many of our societies, that pressure is going to show up sometimes in strange places, just as you were saying, Deb, with a fear of leaving the home being agoraphobic or anorexic, or any of the other qualities that cause strange tensions to build up. And then, as Lisa was saying, from a Jungian perspective, the restorative process is understanding the archetype of Pan, allowing ourselves to really imagine what Pan is as a psychological function, and to be able to give Pan his due, give him his homage, his support, so that those energies have some place to live in the psyche and they're not rumbling like a volcano ready to explode underneath.
And Jung says over and over again that we have lost touch with the instincts symbolized by Pan, not only by Pan, but certainly very much so, and that it is vital that we get it back in touch with the instincts, not to let them, sort of run our personal show, but to give them their due, just as you were saying. And we've distanced ourselves in the modern world very much from these instincts. And so then they go awry or vent out to the side, just as you were saying.
So you were both talking about honoring these instincts. Joseph, you were talking about kind of giving the god Pan his due. And part of that means taking things seriously, as I said before. And it seems to me that one of the only frameworks we really have, or common frameworks we have for doing that, is this kind of psychiatric medical model. So the thing is that when you can say, I have panic attacks, or I have panic disorder, there's a way that you've, in a very impoverished way, you are honoring the god Pan. You were saying, take me seriously. This is real. This is really affecting me. It's a way for the god to come up and assert himself in our life. And this is one of the frameworks we have for understanding it. Unfortunately, though, it comes with consequences to treat it that way because it's not really the right framework. One of the things that can happen, that I've seen happen in my practice, is people confuse ordinary anxiety with having a panic attack. So I had a young student come to me once, and this is a kind of a fictionalized case, by the way. I'm not sharing anyone's real material, but and say, I can't continue with my my studies because I had a panic attack when I tried to take this exam. And I said to her, well, what do you mean? Describe your panic attack for me. She said, well, my heart was racing and my hands got kind of clammy and my mouth got a little dry. And I was thinking, oh, so you were anxious. It wasn't really clear that it was a full-scale panic attack. When we're anxious, some of these things happen. But a psychiatric medical model encourages a kind of diagnostic creep where we can come to understand something through a much more severe lens. When what we want to do is, again, sort of make friends with it and normalize it. It is normal to feel anxious before an exam. Now, if you feel like you're going to have to, you're dying and you're going to have a heart attack, then we might be in the realm of a panic attack, which again, there's normalcy to it too, although it's much more difficult to deal with. In light of this, I want to bring up this quote from Jung, which is perhaps one of the most important quotes in the entire collected works. I know I say it all the time on the podcast, but it certainly is relevant here. Jung says in Collected Works 13, paragraph 54, we think we can congratulate ourselves on having already reached such a pinnacle of clarity, imagining that we have left all these phantasmal gods far behind. But what we have left behind are only verbal specters, not the psychic facts that were responsible for the birth of the gods. We are still as much possessed today by autonomous psychic contents as if they were Olympians. Today, they are called phobias, obsessions, and so forth. In a word, neurotic symptoms. The gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus and produces curious specimens for the doctor's consulting room, or disorders the brains of politicians and journalists who unwittingly let loose psychic epidemics on the world. So there's so much in that, but Pan is certainly today in our solar plexus, and that's how he makes his presence felt. And we do need to figure out how to honor him. I'm not sure that treating it very concretely is always such a good idea.
I think that is just, as ever and often with Jung, incredibly well said. We all sat here for a minute really just taking that in anew. This is so important. But I would like to take a look in another direction at what happens in the collective when there are mass panics, also known as mass hysterias
or psychic epidemics, as Jung said.
Yes, and social contagion and all that. The fear is incredibly contagious. And there is a very, very long list of mass epidemics on our good friend Wikipedia. And they go back to some very peculiar ones, like in the Middle Ages, where nuns had a whole sort of contagion of biting or meowing like cats, which today we might look back on with some amusement. But there are also things that are really horrific, like the Salem witch trials, and there were witch trials in Europe as well, or the kind of awful stampedes that can take place in football stadiums or other kinds of venues, nightclubs and so on, where people are literally trampled to death when there's a panic that sets in. How incredibly contagious feelings are. We go to a wedding and there's dancing afterwards and music and the great revelry. And when there is fear, just like that flock of birds that you referenced earlier, the whole flock takes off. And it makes it all the more important to recognize when fear is fear and when there is really an external threat and then to think about how to react, lest we just get caught up.
And one of the examples that we're right in the middle of is the pandemic, which means that pan means universal, and demos means people. So something that is an illness among all people, pandemic. And as various phases of the COVID-19 illness, the science, and the response to it has continued to evolve, there have been various stampedes. One of the first stampedes, which is almost humorous now, is the stampede for toilet paper. That, within just a few weeks of this emerging, all the paper goods were gone. And there are disturbing, slightly hilarious YouTube videos of people fighting over rolls of toilet paper and knocking each other over, much like on Black Friday when people are fighting over who's going to get that television on sale. But that we do get swept up in this instinctive level. And it's interesting that it's a clamoring for toilet paper, that this,
of
this
all
particular
things.
item, yes, this particular item that we use to manage one of the most undeniable instinctive behaviors that the body does, that no matter how sophisticated we are, we all poop. And toilet paper is about managing
Speak for yourself.
the messiness of that. That was one of the places that the panic went to, the panic for masks, the panic for the vaccines. And we're not here to say any commentary about whether that was right, wrong, or indifferent, but it's an important, real phenomena that happens and will happen again right before our eyes. I have curiosity about this recent upswelling of hostility towards any of the symbols of panic that are associated with COVID-19. That being in a state of panic, as you were both saying, is disabling. It's exhausting. For those of us, for instance, I have type 2 diabetes. If my adrenaline gets to a certain point, my limbs will start shaking because your blood sugar drops. I can't think straight. There's all these strange effects that panic and adrenaline have and cortisol has on the body, particularly when it sweeps over and over and over and over again. So one of my curiosities is the hostility towards all of these COVID-19 elements is an effort to try to contain panic, is an effort to try to exert ego control over something that has been so costly to us psychically, physically, economically. Now that's secondary to whether or not we believe in the science around it or the science of vaccines, but feeling hostile towards the things that put us in panic over and over again is a pretty reasonable way of trying to feel like we've got any control.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting around this discussion about kind of where this happens in groups, and Joseph, I think that's a really interesting take on kind of recent developments around COVID, which honestly, it just kind of leaves my head in a spin. I'm not really sure what to think. But it's so interesting because it really lines up with the mythology, because Pan, his cry was sort of designed to create mass hysteria. It was designed to kind of scatter the opposing troops, or at least it wasn't designed, but that was the result. So there's a kind of recognition right in the mythological material about how this can operate in large groups or in societies.
And in our culture, we do demonize Pan. It's no mistake if anyone's interested, and go back and look at some of the historic images and statues of Pan. He is a male torso and some male arms, and feature in the bottom part of the body is shaggy with cloven feet and often a large goat-like phallus and sometimes a tail.
Mm-hmm.
And in the ambivalence towards the instinctive life, various Christian religions used that image as the symbol of the devil, and in a sense making the one who induces panic the evil one. So in a way, to be honest, some of the stuff that we're hearing about Dr. Fauci and the hostility rising towards him, it's as if Dr. Fauci has been named the new Pan. And just as Pan's screech scattered the Titans in horror, Dr. Fauci's very temperate announcements about COVID-19 have been assigned this Pan-like demonization, as we often do. We actually used to have laws that if somebody just shouted fire in the middle of theater, we would arrest them if there was no fire. That we don't particularly enjoy being set into a state of panic. And now it seems rather humorous, but years ago, when War of the Worlds was a radio show, some of you may be old enough to remember that. Now it's turned into a movie about these alien invasions. It was put forward in a highly realistic way, and people became terrified. It was read as if it was a newscast. And then when people figured out that it was a performance, there was such an enormous outrage. People just wanted to strangle this radio station for putting them in an unnecessary state of panic.
Yeah.
They had become the new Pan, and they were going to take them down, just as the images of Pan were taken down in the Christian era. So it's understandable that we don't want to unnecessarily feel things that make us feel terrible.
We don't want to feel those things. And I'm picking up on a point you just made, Joseph, about feeling out of control. And if there's anything that made us all feel out of control, it was certainly the pandemic. And so we would, somebody like Dr. Fauci had to be perfect, not human, in dealing with a whole new range of things that needed to be dealt with and managed as best as possible. So he gets demonized. And there we have Pan, the rejection and casting him out. Instead of, what you mentioned earlier, Lisa, a couple of times, of being on a friendly basis with human beings and their susceptibility to error, our inherent imperfection, and dealing with the don't know that we are asked to deal with on something like the pandemic and asked to deal with as individuals when we don't have control. And we all like to think in this supposedly modern day and age that our egos are in charge and we should know and everything should be under control. Even something like a pandemic, because our egos want to feel like they are the sole operators, managers of psyche in ourselves as individuals and psyche writ large. And it just isn't so. Pan will have his due.
Pan will have his due, and we do prefer to feel calm. Why not?
Of course.
That's that homeostatic level. But one of you had alluded earlier that the single story around panic is part of that Greco-Roman storytelling. And in the beginning, when Zeus is fighting the Titans and the war is quite uncertain, Pan is brought in, and his weapon is to issue this unearthly screaming sound that is so powerful that it evokes panic, horror in the Titans and scatters them as they run off. To me, that's quite important, that there's a relationship between panic and war. And one of the difficulties that we're having when we're treating somebody with a panic disorder is that they think the war is in the college exam, or they think the war is in the supermarket, or they think the war is in the neighbor that gives them the stink eye. And so panic sets in as a scattering intensity, but they haven't placed the real war. It's a substitute war. And that's one of the things that we're saying over and over again is the thing that you think is the problem is rarely the problem, but it shows up there. And that has to do with the way that the psyche projects unconscious information. And there might even be a very symbolic legitimacy of why the supermarket, for instance, is the most horrifying place. That may have to do with all kinds of subtle meanings around food and shopping and preparing, or the subtle meanings of the university and other realms. But when panic happens, a war is somewhere, and we have to courageously find the real war. And Jung helped us out by naming a few more instincts beyond just sexuality, which is a funny way to think about it. The war is almost always against one or more of the instincts. These instincts are part of the natural forest of the psyche, and Pan is the lord of forests. Jung's instincts, or his instinctive categories, are creativity, reflection, activity, sexuality, and hunger. Very interesting way to map it. Where is my war with creativity? Where is my war with self-reflection? Where is my war with being active? Where is my war against sexuality? Where is my war against hunger? And when the ego is at war with any or all of those realms, that the instinctive world is capable of emitting a kind of shrieking quality to stun the ego, to send it into a kind of decompensation so that the forest might desperately try to reestablish the naturalness of the personality, that it is an attack against the ego's arrogant supremacy.
Yeah, that's really great, Joseph. And I think that's a wonderful way to really sum up, in some sense, what we've been talking about. But I do want to bring in one final thing before we head to a dream, which is in this battle, in this war, it's okay to use tools. And one of the tools might be medication. If you just kind of glance at the evidence base for long-term daily use of benzodiazepines, I'm not really sure that I'm convinced that that's a great idea. But boy, can they have a place with a kind of PRN, or as needed use, if you are subject to occasional panic attacks. So when someone presents to me and they've had a panic attack, I'll often recommend that they make an appointment with a psychiatrist to discuss the possibility of getting a prescription for an anxiolytic and anti-anxiety medication like Xanax on an as-needed basis. Because what will happen is, if you start to feel a panic attack coming on, and then you take a benzodiazepine or another medication for anxiety, it'll be a little bit like a sledgehammer. It'll kind of stop all of that physiological arousal and kind of force your body back into a relaxed state. And, there might be times when you need to do that. But I'll tell you something else. Most people that I've recommended who've gone this route will carry 3 or 4 little pills of Xanax around with them in case they start to have a panic attack at work, or when they're on a date, or whenever else. And just knowing that they've got that in their bag or in their pocket will depotentiate some of the fear, because really we're talking about a fear of fear. And they often don't need to take them. If you do, that's fine. But even just knowing that you have this tool, this recourse, can be helpful.
And often such a prescription will be issued for just a very few of these. So that alleviates a lot of today's anxiety about, really becoming habituated or dependent upon it. I had one client who it was sort of the safety thing that he would carry around. And as things got better and better, one day he pulled out this tiny little plastic bag, and the Xanax had dissolved into a powder because he had carried it around with him in his wallet for so long. And never used it. And it's a little bit like Dumbo and the feather that he carried. If you remember the story of Dumbo with his the circus elephant with the overlarge ears, the mouse, Timothy Mouse, told him he could fly if he held a feather in his trunk, and that the feather would enable him to fly. And Dumbo believed it, and he flew. And then, of course, one day while he was flying, he dropped the feather, and Timothy Mouse was down below saying, no, you did it. You did it yourself. It was never the feather. But sometimes having that kind of a talisman itself can be incredibly powerful. And stopping an anxiety attack helps us practice. Of like, okay, this thing is not all powerful. I do have a tool that I can use. And then it catches hold psychologically.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So being able to stay relaxed at some point is required to be able to go down a little deeper and to ask these questions of what has been subverted in me, which might be causing this. I'm going to take a different position, just so that our conversation is balanced, and I totally understand the use of medication, is that we do have an example of a satyr, a goat-footed deity who was medicated, which is Silenus, that in Dionysus's long train of dancing fauns and satyrs and nymphs, his foster father was this chubby, pot-bellied, bearded, white-haired satyr, goat-footed fellow named Silenus. And Silenus's name is derived from a Greek word that means to move to and fro. To and fro. So the cautionary note is that we can use medication, and we should if we're paralyzed by fear for disproportionate amounts of time. But one of the difficulties with medicating panic is that we move to and fro. We're constantly moving towards the panic and away from it, and towards the panic and away from it in a kind of iterative cycle. So one of the goals perhaps is in a calmer moment, when the nervous system is being restrained, to go in with a kind of determination. I'm going to figure out what part of the forest inside of me have I gone to war with, and what do I need to do to open that up so that I'm not in distress so much. I'd like to also end on a positive note, is despite the efforts to turn Pan into Satan, or any of Pan's representatives into dangerous and demonic beings, fauns, goat-footed boys, continue to rise up in the collective culture, often in ways that are heroic and important. And I'd like to just talk about Mr. Tumnus in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that when the three children who are escaping panic, by the way, they have been sent to the countryside because the war is beginning to encroach upon the cities in England, and children were sent out and temporarily orphaned, fostered. There's a tremendous amount of panic in that whole world. the kids find their way in the story through a coat closet, which often is a place that we all have hidden as children, containing. And when they come into the new world of Narnia, the first one that greets them is Mr. Tumnus, who looks kind of like an adolescent boy. He's got a kind of patchy beard on the sides. It's not really grown in. He's very skinny and a little nervous and awkward. But he is the emissary between the worlds, half human and half forest. And he turns into the hero. At first he's a spy for the Winter Witch, who is freezing the psyche in panic and fear. Like Medusa, she's locking everything down in ice. That ice-cold feeling that people will report when they're in a panic attack, it literally will feel like ice is flowing into their limbs in a panic, and the Winter Witch is part of that. But Mr. Tumnus understands as he matures from his boyishness and becomes attached to the kids, that he needs to be on the side of warmth, on the side of Aslan, who is the image of life eternal, life that cannot be extinguished, and the image that suffering can be held in a transformative way. And when he shifts his allegiance to the warmth of true suffering, that he plays a pivotal role in unfreezing this inner world and the facilitation of the growth of the children into their mature selves, heroic selves. So, fawns, the world of adolescent boys, who in a sense are the children of Pan during that time period of their lives, full of instinct and sexuality and scruffy, hairy-leggedness, are still alive and well. And if we can honor Pan, we might be able to honor these stages that our children go through as natural and instinctive and on the way to a kind of heroic position.
Well, it seems like a good place to end. So before we switch to a dream, I just want to remind you all that we have a Patreon. That's a platform where you can support us. We have production costs associated with the podcast, and it's great to get support from our listeners. It keeps us from needing to look for corporate sponsorship. So we really appreciate it. You will get access to additional material that we create every week. And you can check that out by going to our website, thisjungianlife.com. And if you click on the podcast, you'll see a place where that links to our Patreon.
So now let us switch to a dream. This week's dream is from a woman who's 55 years old. She used to be in education and is currently unemployed. And here's her dream. I dreamt that I was at my old workplace and in an elevator, and an assistant I don't know hands me a note that says that my boss wants me to go to her office at a certain time. This angers and frustrates me because she doesn't know I no longer work there, and I have no intention of going to go see her. Then I am walking down the hall with a bunch of other people, and I think it would be interesting to just see what she wants. I walk into a large conference room full of people who work there, and my boss is there too. We are supposed to give lectures, but I don't want to, and I am angry and also nervous that she expects me to give a lecture. There is a man who is older and obviously old-fashioned, and not at all hip or up-to-date, and I sort of jokingly, and to embarrass my boss, tell him that he should give the first lecture. He starts to do so, and I am amused at first, but then I really like what he is saying, and so do most of the other people in the room, except my boss, who thinks he's ridiculous and totally stupid. The man is older and has gray hair. He is distinguished looking, but disheveled like a professor. He's handsome, or clearly used to be. He is in a plexiglass box giving the lecture. I notice that he's holding something that is like a Eucharist host, but it has a gold coin in the middle. I can imagine what it would feel and taste like to bite into it. It would taste like the host, thin and brittle with a slight flavor of bread, but also hard and metallic from the gold coin. I really like what he is saying, and I am surprised because I thought it would be stupid, and I only had him talk to annoy my boss, but everyone realizes how what he has to say is really interesting. And for context, she says, I just quit my job of 8 years because I felt that my boss didn't respect my work and treated me poorly. I'm now unsure what to do with myself and fear falling into irrelevance. The main feelings in the dream were frustration, anger, pretense, petty vengeance, and at the end, real interest and surprise. And for additional context, our dreamer says, I associate pettiness with my boss. I really liked my workplace because it is in a beautiful building. The plexiglass box reminds me of interesting exhibits in museums. The Eucharist. I was raised Catholic but do not practice any religion. When I was a kid, I always liked the feeling of the Eucharist wafer dissolving on my tongue. I love gold. I think it is very beautiful and has strong energetic qualities. I associate the gold with the mask of Agamemnon.
Well, the first thing that comes up for me is, what about this boss? this boss in the dream. The classical formulation, a female figure in the dream of a woman might be considered to be a shadow figure. So this dream is about the boss, but we also have to imagine that this boss is an image of some qualities that are in the dreamer that she may not be aware of, or she may not be in relationship to. And I notice that she says of her boss that she associates pettiness with the boss. But she herself in the dream is actually being quite petty. She has asked the old man to talk first to annoy her boss, and she admits that her feelings in the dream included petty vengeance. So somehow the boss is an image of her own inner pettiness. And the dream tells us something about how to be in relationship with that. And I actually think the dream has a fairly creative answer to it. First of all, I note that in what feels to me tremendously important, she's willing to go see. At first she says, I don't want to see that boss. And then she says, I think it might be interesting to just see what she wants. So there is an openness to the unconscious. There is an openness to what this boss might be able to offer to her. And by that willingness to engage, she comes across this wise old man figure who holds something so deep. And I can see you're both nodding, and I know you probably both have a lot to say. So I'll stop there and let you guys unpack some of it.
Before we build on this, I want to pick up on something you said, that yes, there is that sort of vengeance-taking aspect of our dream ego. But what I am wondering is whether that is in fact something she needs to get in touch with. Of, okay, I think I will. I'll take the dare. I'll just go in and I'll see what she wants. And then I'll fight fire with fire. So I'm appreciating that there might be a hint of our dream ego's ability to deal with aggression that could be very useful, needed, and important. Also, I believe this dreamer that the boss was really difficult and
I do too.
And harassing.
I do too.
And
Yes.
so there might be a real need for, I can fight back kind of energy. What I really appreciate is the first attitude, we're supposed to give lectures, but I don't want to, and I'm angry. And why should I have to do this? And then the man shows up. And isn't he wonderful? He's not at all up to date. He's not hip, but he has a kind of professorial demeanor or presentation. So he's knowledgeable. There's something kind of ancient, older, a kind of wise old man aspect to our dreamer.
I think everything what you guys have said is right on target. I don't know that I have a lot to add. I think
yes, you do. Of course you do.
seeing the boss as a shadow figure, it's important that in the dream ego supports the older fellow in giving the lecture because she expects to embarrass the boss, and she expects that this man is going to embarrass himself, and that's really pleasurable to her. And then she looks over at the boss, who thinks that the old man is ridiculous and totally stupid. So it's this unavoidable process of shadow connection. And the thing that we have trouble tolerating in ourselves or understanding in ourselves is the thing that we have trouble tolerating and understanding in another person. I don't know whether the dream boss is exactly like the outer boss, but at least in this qualitative way, it's important to look at that and to perhaps be a bit suspicious about it. She and the boss are also contemptuous towards the inner old man. And so a question that I would have is her relationship towards older men in her life. I'd be curious to know what her relationship with her father was like, what it was with her grandfather, and particularly what her mother's attitude towards her father was. Because there's a certain kind of dance going on in the psyche that I think is complicated. The important medicine in the dream is that her attitude towards the man in the glass box improves, and she can see value that she couldn't have imagined early on, and value for her personally. We can't separate out whatever he's speaking from the Eucharist, so to me he represents a higher evolution of the animus, moving really a little bit away from the father, away from the lover, away from the administrator, and moving towards this kind of spirit of truth, which is something that Barbara Hanna suggested as a final evolution of the animus. So it also suggests that there have been some things that have improved over time. The plexiglass box reminds me very much of the alchemical vase. We often put certain things, certain psychic contents in a container so that it can evolve. It may be that the images become more attractive over time because it has been contained, and that the Eucharistic gold represents something about that mythopoetic image of Christ, and as an antidote to the chronic anger, that there is a potential for gentleness, for loving kindness, for forgiveness towards herself, towards perhaps people who have caused her great suffering, including the boss. But there is a possibility that if she could get into the box or let him out of the box, that she could partake in whatever that symbolizes and experience some of that archetypal help inside of herself.
I just want to lift up this incredible ending symbol that just needs to say, a word about it. So we have the host. Joseph, I know you were raised Catholic. It's round, right? The host is usually round.
It is in that formal environment.
And so, we have, it's such an incredible image, right? This little wafer with the gold in the middle. And of course, the host itself is incredibly symbolic. It's supposed to be, after the magic of the Mass and transubstantiation, literally the body of Christ in the Catholic Mass. So there's this deep magic that happens, and there's gold in it. Gold is the thing of supreme value. Gold does not rust. Gold is eternal. So she's found something in being willing to go and see what the boss has to say. She has found something of supreme, transpersonal value.
And the gold is incorruptible. However distressed she may be about these negative feelings, there is something in the psyche that cannot be corrupted by her bad feelings and this anger inside of herself. The last bit that I want to share, because I think it's so important, Right now, we are in a culture that is venerating rage, which is a form of emotional violence. It just is. Doesn't matter who's saying it. But to want to attack somebody with our voices, with our allegations in other ways, there's a way in which it can be very seductive. But the dream is really offering something else. And I want to share a quote from Simone Weil, who was a philosopher and a theologian on the turn of the century. And she says, "The false God turns suffering into violence. The true God turns violence into suffering." And I think that this dream is offering that perspective. The rage that disrupted the career and might still be leaving her without firm footing about what's next is an over-veneration of violence. Violence of feeling and the pleasure of tearing the expectations of the boss down and tearing the job apart and tearing up these things that aggravate me all the time.
And it really has only hurt her.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's kind of, it's her, because she quit the job and now she's left with the rage and worried about being irrelevant. So I think that's a great point, Joseph. I'm really glad that you brought that up.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.